Good morning. This is the BLAINESWORLD podcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can also listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can find us as well at the BLAINESWORLD.net website. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. And I'm speaking with a friend of mine, well-known author, philosopher, man about town, James Navé. And welcome aboard, Navé. Good to see you.
Thank you, Blaine. I appreciate you inviting me onto this show. It's a pleasure, man. Thanks.
Okay. Well, it's been too long since we were on. I think you were on a couple of years ago. Always a pleasure. And I have to ask you the question, which I've been wondering about. I introduce you as James Navé, but people call you usually Navé. Is there a story behind that?
Well, we all have a story behind our names because if you ask anyone and dig a little deeper, they'll tell you their life story just based on who they are, their name, which is where we begin. When we're born, we get a name. So when I was born, my family lived in Asheville, which is my hometown. I'm a native Western North Carolinian, and the family name comes from Tennessee, across the mountain. Highway 23 north to Johnson City and Chuckey and Jonesboro, where the National Storytelling Festival is. And my family name is Nave. And if you go to Tennessee, up around Johnson City, you'll see many signs, businesses, roads, things like that, with the name Nave on it. My father and my father, actually my grandfather, no, my father and grandfather and the family came over the mountain in the early 50s, and Sam Nave was his name, my grandfather. J.C. Nave was my father's name, and I was Jimmy Nave. So when I was in Venable Elementary School, everybody knew me as Jimmy Nave. And then when I finally got to high school, I became still Jimmy, but I was moving to Jim. Finally, when I went to college, I became Jim Nave. And early 70s, during the oil embargo, the first one, 1972, I was standing out in front of Lynn Holloway's antique store in Cashers, North Carolina, and I was working on a surveying crew, little entrepreneurial thing. I was terrible at math, so I couldn't do much surveying, but I tried. And this fellow came out of the Lynn Holloway's antique store, and I don't remember his name, but he was wearing an Izod t-shirt. I think it was green or blue, and then he had trousers on that had Budweiser printed on them. And he was part of the Budweiser entourage that summered in Cashers. And so Roger Grow, the fellow I was working with, introduced me. This is Jim Nave. And this fellow looked at me and he said, Nave? Nave? No, 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 no. Everybody knows it's Navé. And I was like, well, that's a pretty good suggestion. That's kind of interesting. And so about 3 years later, when I moved to another town, to Charlotte, in fact, and I was working as a waiter in a restaurant, I thought, well, I'm going to do an experiment. I don't know any of these people, so I'll just introduce myself as Jim Navé. And I went into the restaurant. I'm Jim Navé, Jim Navé, Jim Navé. So in 1974, I believe, was when Navé came into usage. And later people just started to say, oh, Navé, Navé, because it was a fun name to say. My brother, Sam, changed his name from Nave to Navé, and now I have two nephews and nieces with children that are going by Navé. And so people often will ask me, well, is Navé your spiritual name? And I'm like, well, actually, in I've heard in Spanish it means vessel. And some people have told me in Hebrew, I don't speak Hebrew, but some of my friends who do said, well, it means deep well. I go to France a lot. I've spent a lot of time in Paris. I love Paris, but I've often wondered why my friends in France never call me Navé. They call me Jim. Oh, Jim, it's good to see you. Not James, Jim. And a few years ago, I learned Navé in French means bland turnip, or in French slang, it means bad movie. So that's my spiritual name, Navé, and it means bad movie in French. So I'm aspiring to great things. So far, I've gotten to the bad movie. I hope it'll move on later down the line. So that's the story of my name.
Or accepting maybe it'll be an actual movie at one point.
Well, it may well be. I don't know. It might be a short. We'll enter it in the short movie contest.
We'll talk about your story, and it's a great story, James, or Navé. I call you, I guess Navé, I do call you
But you can
typically.
do both. People call me James. They call me
Mm.
Navé. The little kids used to call me Jim Navé. It was like one word. And the people that have known me for years just call me Jim back in the day when we were having fun in the younger years.
And you mentioned little kids. Talk about when you were a little kid. So you grew up in North Carolina, you told me before. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer, for example? When did you decide you wanted to become a writer?
I never decided I wanted to become a writer. I had no idea that was something that I wanted to do. I grew up on Brevard Road. If you drive out Brevard Road, Highway 191, Brevard, North Carolina is where
Right?
that road will eventually take you. You will cross Interstate 26. And when you cross Interstate 26, you will see a plethora of commercialization there. Hotels,
Sure.
mall, all of that. And for those people listening, if you've never been in Asheville, 26 going south toward Charleston in South Carolina is going near the airport. It's south of town. And when I grew up on Brevard Road, I grew up in that right there on that intersection. And if you now drive that area, you will drive over an exit ramp that has replaced my family home. And when I grew up on Brevard Road in the 50s, we had a 2-lane road and we had no people particularly around. My grandmother, the Navé family lived on one end of the lane, and my grandmother Roberta and her family, my mother's side, lived on the other end. My grandmother Roberta Hyatt came to Western North Carolina in 1916. She graduated from Meredith College and came to Murphy to teach school and do some missionary work. So on my mother's side, we had tradition of college education that went back to the 1800s. On my father's side, it was more uh, working people, although plenty of people on that side of the family had education as well. So we lived on Pine Lane on Brevard Road. It's still there, but it's not like it once was because it did have pine trees when I was growing up. And I grew up around letters. My mother was a reader, and my grandmother Roberta was actually a poet. So I was surrounded by it, but it never occurred to me to be a writer. Although my mother often would quote Ulysses by Tennyson from me, she would say, "You are a part of all that you have met, yet all experience is an arch, where through gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever as you move." And she would say, "You were born, and when I looked upon you, I thought you were a child of the universe. So my only wish for you to be successful is just be yourself." And that was that, Ulysses and be yourself. I thought it was good advice. So I grew up on Pine Lane and was surrounded by all of the country activities that one would do in Western North Carolina. And I was surrounded by my father, who worked for the power company, Carolina Power and Light, which I guess is now Progressive Energy, maybe. I don't know what they have around Asheville that provides electricity for everybody. And my mother was a nurse. And my father was a World War II veteran, and he brought himself back home from the war, was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was a photographer in the war. And he also loved to play music. So when he came back from the war, having stolen a fiddle from a mantle on Germany, I don't know why, brought it back, and he played the fiddle with a great number of Appalachian fiddlers all around Western North Carolina. My good friend David Holt
Sure.
came to the area in the 70s or 80s, and he knew my father. And I met David through my father because David was a young man then, and he was collecting all the old time musicians. Tommy Bell was one of them, the great Tommy Bell, who played Listen to the Mockingbird, and you could hear the birds sing on his fiddle strings. So my father played the fiddle. He taught me how to play the guitar. And my mother introduced me to poetry, but it never occurred to me to be a writer. I just wanted to be free. I was driven to go out beyond the mountains and see what the world looked like. And I wanted to be free.
So
And I,
when did you start writing?
oh, I was 40.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, 40 maybe. I didn't really start writing, in earnest until I was 40. It's a treasured hobby. Before that, I had a pizza restaurant. I was an investigator for a lawyer. I had a hiking store. I sold T-shirts all over America. I waited tables. I hitchhiked all over the country. I was we had a great deal of fun in our 20s, and then and actually probably to really the seed for all of the creative language exploration, which is really what this is about. This is not about writing. Writing is a sideshow. It's not a sideshow. That's disrespectful. It's more a writing would be a byproduct of thinking. It's a byproduct of the desire to interact with language on multiple levels. So writing is just one delivery system among many, as we are now on this podcast. This is a delivery system. Our content will go out in a certain way. David Holt, great storyteller. He delivered his music on the stage like my father did. So the storytellers, they deliver in one way. We deliver with our smartphones. We deliver with our computers. It's all about delivery and exploration around language. So when I was in my 30s, I had flunked out of Brevard College. I went to Brevard Junior College, 1968 through 70, and I flunked out. Terrible student. But I did have enough insight to understand that I needed to avoid going to Vietnam. So after going to Brevard College, I applied for a conscientious objector status and was awarded a conscientious objector status by way of the draft board. And I served 2 years alternate service in Charlotte, North Carolina, working as an orderly for $1.65 an hour. I finally was raised to $2.25 an hour. So I worked 2 years as an orderly at Wesley Nursing Center, basically taking care of the patients, cleaning the beds, making sure the food was there, just orderly work. And so when I flunked out of Brevard College, but I graduated into an awareness, a political awareness. So throughout my 20s, I did all the hiking stores and I did the T-shirts and I ran a little pizza restaurant on the beach and it was too much fun, really. And finally, I landed back in Asheville in 1979. And in 1981, I went to the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And that's when I started to think about language, how we communicate, how we talk, how we express ourselves, what we do in order to connect as human beings. And at that storytelling festival in 1981, I sat in the audience and listened to the great storytellers. Connie Reagan Blake was there,
Sure.
and Barbara Freeman were there. They were doing the folk tellers at the time. Connie and Barbara are no longer together as storytellers. Uh, Connie has gone on to be one of the great storytellers of America, and all of the new people back then were there. And it was the beginning of the storytelling renaissance. Although I will say that in 1981, I attended the 9th Storytelling Festival. So it had been going on a decade almost by the time I got there. So at that Storytelling Festival, I thought, wow, how do they do that? Look at that. I would love to try that. How? And I couldn't figure out, sitting there in that audience, what they were doing that made them so comfortable. I later learned it was practice and rehearsal. At the time, it just seemed so magical that I thought they just appeared out of nowhere and there they were on the stage. So I came back the next year on the 10th annual Storytelling Festival and brought a bunch of friends with me. And it was at that Storytelling Festival, I was thinking, okay, what if you did want to be a storyteller? How would you go about it? Now, I had never written a thing. I'd never even done anything really. But by that point, I had enrolled at UNCA as an adult returning student, and I was taking literature classes, and I had enrolled in a French class, and I had enrolled in a drama class. I had gone back to school because I had flunked out, and I was so upset. I felt stupid. I wanted to get an education. So thank you, UNCA. I went back. And at UNCA, I came across a teacher, Wilsonia Cherry, Dr. Wilsonia Cherry, and she was teaching a romantic literature course. And in the course, she read a poem. And I'm sitting there eagerly waiting to take in all of this. And the poem she read was Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I was really trying to follow along. And when she got to the line, when Ulysses said, I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever as I move. Oh my God, that's the line my mother quoted to me when I was a child. And I just shook. And I looked at that, and it was a 72-line poem. I'm going to memorize this. This is going to be where my story starts. This is my entry into my dance with language.
By the way,
And
is Dr. Cherry still around?
no, she's not at
Oh,
UNCA.
no, is she around anywhere?
I don't know. Let's hope she
Oh,
is.
it's too bad.
On some dimension she is. I don't know.
Because I'd love to be able to share that story, with her that, made such a difference.
Yeah, it did. So I go down the hall to the office and say, please make 3 copies. I got 3 copies, and it took me months to memorize the thing. It was ridiculous, actually. I didn't know how to do it, so I struggled. But I finally got it. And then Bob Falls, who lived in Asheville. By that time, I knew Bob. He was working for the Social Security Administration. He was a disability claims rep, and he said, "Well, if you memorize one more, and I'll memorize 2, we'll have a show." And so I did. And then a couple of years later, we formed a business called Poetry Alive, and we sent teams of poets around the country performing poetry as theater for school students. And we had 7 teams of poets traveling. By 1989, we had 7 teams on the road. We were grossing $500,000 a year, cruising around America, reciting poetry in school programs. And it wasn't that hard to do. We spent all the money, of course, because it's hard to keep a lot of people on the road, even back then. But we had a really good time. And at somewhere in that time frame from 1984, when we did our first show at McDibb's, a 2-hour show, and we invited all our friends to come. Place filled up. McDibb's was on Cherry Street. For those of you who live in Asheville, McDibb's was the first listening room that existed in Western North Carolina. And in many ways, you could trace all of the music scene that we know now back to McDibb's in the early 80s in Black Mountain, North Carolina. David Holt was there. Jerry Jeff Walker came through. Taj Mahal, John Sebastian, David Wilcox got his start there. David Lamont got his start there. Annie Lally was a terrific singer. She was there, and so many people came through, and we were part of that crowd. So it started in 84. And so by the time I sold it to my partner, Bob Falls, in 1991, we had done thousands and thousands of shows. And Poetry Alive continued, and I think it even continues on to this day in different variations. I think if you did the numbers, we would top out over the 30 years at presentations of live poetry, Poetry Alive, 25 million students, maybe.
You can imagine teaching students poetry, and not only teaching it, but them loving it, as a result of, you teaching it.
Well, they loved the action.
Right.
And they loved the animation. And what they most particularly loved was the opportunity to participate without restrictions. It was rather improvisational, even though we were working with very traditional pieces. Like, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and the frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. And that's Stopping by Woods by Robert Frost. Most students come across that, probably still do. And we would get the students to sit on a sleigh and pretend like they were driving a horse through the woods. So they didn't think of it as, oh, this is a very important thing, poetry. It's like, wow, we can play. And play is the key to creativity.
Now, may talk a little bit about what you just said there, and that's the idea of memorizing poetry. And I remember as a kid, I had to remember, you were forced to memorize a poem or something. Good or bad thing to have people memorize poetry?
Well, what do you think?
Well, I'm not big on memorization, so I don't love it. I love talking off a topic, but I'm amazed you seem to have like a very good memory, would you say?
I would say that my memory is an average memory. My memory is no better or worse than yours or anybody else's. And the reason why people have a negative feeling around memorization is similar to the reason why they have negative feelings around mathematics.
Probably. Go ahead.
It's poorly taught. And you get often people have reported to me they have a negative experience around memorization. We were forced to
Right.
memorize. Okay. If you talk to anybody who has memorization in their work, so like an actor, for example, and you ask them, well, how do you memorize? How do you memorize for theater? And theater is a good place to start regarding memorization because that's the basis of the character. You actually have to know the lines in order to be able to deliver the material on stage and interact with the character, other characters on the stage. And you also have to know the lines so well, you forget them. And what I mean by that is you just don't think about it. They're
Right.
there, just like this conversation between us is present in this interview. So memorization, when approached from an organic point of view, is quite easy. Memorization, when it's approached from, oh my God, I've got to get this right, I'm forced to do it, and I have to deliver it in 3 days, you might as well just, cut your little finger off because it's that painful, because there's so much there's so many built-in stumbling blocks. And those stumbling blocks make you feel like you have no intelligence at all. Gee, I just can't do this. This is really awful. My memory is not good. That's the natural conclusion. When in fact, your memory is just fine. You're trying to do something that is almost impossible, which is to ingest usually fairly complicated propositions fast and then try to remember them and regurgitate them without any of the techniques that an actor or a person who memorizes would know how to use. So, for example, if somebody wants to memorize something, I always say, well, I'll teach you how to memorize a poem right now. So I'll do this with you. Are you ready to memorize a poem, Blaine?
Go ahead.
Blaine Greenfield is going to memorize. So are you ready? I guarantee that you will have this poem memorized, okay? And you'll be able to, and I'm going to ask you to recite it on air. So are you ready?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll give you the title first. So get prepared. On the Antiquity of Fleas.
On the antiquity of fleas.
You could say it again.
Oh, on the antiquity of fleas.
Okay, so I will now ask you to introduce the poem, and I'm going to perform it first, and then I'll give you a chance to perform it. So I want you to introduce the title, and then I'll perform the poem.
Okay. Navé, I'm introducing Navé, who's going to talk to do the poem on the antiquity of fleas.
Adam Haddam. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce Blaine Greenfield. He's going to do on the antiquity of fleas. So, my friends out there in listening land, here's Blaine Greenfield on the antiquity of fleas.
Adam.
Okay. So now you have one poem memorized, and
Thank
you
you.
laugh, and yet that's a very serious
I hear you.
proposition because once you realize, oh, this is not about volume. This is about play and enjoyment. And it's about figuring out how to have fun with language. And there is no requirement to get anything long, and there's no deadline on it. The only requirement is your commitment to enjoyment around learning something and remembering it. So every time I work with people on a piece, I ask them, like, say, for example, coming back to Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. So the first line is, whose woods these are, I think I know. That's it. Whose woods these are, I think I know. If you are in the theater, you would spend quite a bit of time trying to determine the name of the person who owned the woods, how many times the woods had been sold. Are you in the Southern Highlands? Are you in the aspen groves around Colorado? Are you in the northern woods of Canada? Whose woods these are, I think I know. His name is William, and his address is 433 Smith Street, and he lives in Jackson, Maine. My mother fell in love with William when he was in high school, but William married my mother's best friend. I've had dinner with William before. He's now old. I know this is Williams Woods, but he doesn't mind me driving through the woods. Whose woods these are? It's Williams Woods. Yeah, I think I know.
You know,
So
it's so funny you're doing that because that's what all actors I know, or many of them do. The same thing too. They create the backstory
character
to
development, yeah.
plot, and it enables them to memorize it. But now I'm going to have to fast forward a little bit because we're running up against the clock, unfortunately. Let me ask you to talk about poetry, where you did set guidelines when you wrote this collection. I just want to talk a little bit about it. What was the name of it? 100 different poems, or what was the name of it again? 100
Well,
days,
I just came out with a book called 100 Days. Here it
right?
is. I will visualize it for those of you who can see it on Facebook. 100 Days, Poems After Cancer. It's actually a poetic memoir. I had prostate cancer when I was 61, and I had surgery, woke up on April 1st, and decided after my surgery, which was successful, and I did achieve what was desired, which was to eliminate the cancer from my body, and I had time to heal. So I thought, well, I could write a poem. What else do I have to do? So I wrote one and posted it on Facebook, day one, April 1st. And then I followed that with the next day, the next day, the next day. I ended up with 30 days. April is poetry month, 30-30. Poets write poems, 30 poems in 30 days. And then I said, well, why not just go on? Let's go for 100. So I wrote 100 poems in 100 days. And then 4 years ago, Andrea Watson at 3 Press in Denver said, do you have a manuscript? And I said, yeah, I have 100 poems in 100 days. So I gave her the manuscript. And a month ago, she returned this beautiful, beautiful book designed by her son, Bill Watson, who teaches book design at Parsons in New York. And he also has an architectural firm, Castro Watson in New York. And he delivered an architecturally designed book. And it's absolutely, absolutely gorgeous.
By
And
the way,
I am
I just want to ask you if somebody wants to get a hold of that particular book, what's the best bet?
jamesnavé.com. You just go to jamesnavé.com, and there you will find the links to the work that I've done, and you'll be able to order it, or you can also send me an email and ask me about it. While I'm on that subject, I am going to do a limited book launch in Asheville. It's going to be on the 25th of June. It's by invitation only, and that's because I only have room for 49 people. So if you would like to come, you can send me an email through my website, jamesnavé.com, contact, and I'll get the email, and I will put you on the list. I'm inviting my friends, so I'm keeping it kind of limited, and I want to make sure that I have room for everybody and I don't turn people away. So if you want to reach out to me and ask about that, I'll be glad to connect with you and give you some information about this launch in Asheville, June the 25th.
And by the way, this launch is for this book we just held up.
This is for 100 poems, 100 days.
Because
It's a
what
poetic memoir, yes.
because one
I'm
of the things
holding it up again.
I've admired about you, Navé, is I've read several of your other things you wrote. I want to just talk about a couple of them. You also wrote a series. I thought they were terrific. There were a series of very short books, and I forgot the name of them. You called them. You had a collection of books, which I just loved.
Oh, I can show you those as well. It's a collection called "Write What You Don't Know." It's a book that gives you 10 steps to writing with confidence, energy, and flow. I co-wrote that with Allegra Houston. It's based on the imaginative storm method, which rose out of the Poetry Alive story that I told. And then I have another book that Allegra and I co-wrote, a tiny little book called
Right.
How to Read for an Audience. And in this, it talks about how to engage in your reading process when you go for an open mic. And then Allegra, a companion book that I didn't write, How to Edit and Be Edited. Allegra wrote this book, and it's just about how to have a relationship with your editing process as well as editors, and how to ask the right questions when you're trying to produce your written material. And finally, I will be in Asheville on the 22nd of Thursday, the 22nd of June, working with Barry Barton at the TEDx Red Rug Roundtable Salon. And if you want to know more about that, go to tedxasheville.com. And this is a book that Allegra and I published, How to Make a Speech, by the genius Barry Barton, who teaches speech and presentation in Asheville. And this is more for people who want to actually write and make speeches, and then how to read for an audience as a companion as well. This is more casual, just walking into a room and doing a reading and feeling comfortable with it.
And what I love about your books, Navé, and I've read a couple of the small books, is that they're to the point, but they're easy to grasp, and you just get into it. And specifically, I haven't read it yet, but if you talk about 10 steps to writing with confidence, energy, and flow, I like to also, you had the chapter, then you were telling me the other day on the phone, you also have like assignments after each chapter, or there's work you want people to do.
Well, you in write what you don't know, and the reason why it's write what you don't know is because actually everything that you've ever experienced, you've forgotten a lot of it. So when you really dig into your work, into your psychology, the swamp of your psychology, you will discover things that surprise you, and you might say, "Gee, I didn't know that." And that's where write what you don't know comes from. I didn't know that. Well, you didn't know it. And so this book is laid out in 10 chapters, and it has 43 different prompts with a 10-minute timed writing on each prompt. And if you follow through each chapter, at the end of this, you will have 40 pieces of writing that you could revise. And actually, if you wanted to, with a bit of effort and work, you could turn it into a book. And if you were thinking about writing a memoir and you wanted to stay focused on the subject of your life, you could focus on that at the beginning of this course. And at the end, you would have a really great compilation of your work. So you would have 45 pieces. I have 100 pieces in my 100 Poems in 100 Days book. It's a poetic memoir. But I'm working with another concept called the manageable memoir. And it occurred to me that most people who try to tell their life story, they get so bogged down. Oh my God, how am I going to tell this? I have to just suffer. Here we are back to suffering. And I'm not a big fan of that. I think if you can suffer a little bit, maybe you have some angst around your story. But I'm more of a fan of like, okay, just relax. You don't have to tell the whole thing. You could write 10 minutes a day for 100 days and have 100 pages, and you would have a manageable memoir. And I guarantee you, whatever you wrote each day would have a narrative arc that would astound you. And if you've never written a thing in your life, if you did that for 10 minutes every day and then just did a little editing on it and make it in your own voice, it doesn't have to be great writing. It just has to be writing, because writing is great by its nature. And you can always massage it to be better. We can all do that. That's the editing thing.
Got to ask
So
you a question.
that's how you can do that.
A question, if I can, about the book we're talking about, 10 Steps to Writing. So I did get into it, starting it. And you give one bit of advice that I have to ask you about. You talked about you recommend writing by hand or with a pen as opposed to using a computer. Okay. Right. You remember that was in that book.
Yes,
I think, right?
that's there. That is
Yeah.
there. Yes.
But here's my problem, Navé, is I have the world's worst handwriting, and it's getting even worse. It really is. And so I really almost can't read my handwriting, you know? So if I did what you suggested, I'd put all that stuff down, but I have trouble reading it. How do you work around that?
Well, I don't. If you can't read your writing, then you will have to you have to dictate.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a
I
good
mean,
thought.
I don't have any. I'm not attached to the handwritten text. The reason why I like the idea of starting out with the handwritten text is because it's messy. The very thing that you describe, the very thing that you're saying,
Right.
I can't read my handwriting, is exactly why you want to do it. Because I'll bet you that even though you say you can't read your handwriting, I'll bet you if you wrote for 10 minutes and then you looked at what you wrote, you would be able to read a percentage
Oh,
of it.
true. That's a good point.
You
Yeah.
would be able to. I mean, you wouldn't just go like, well, I have, gee, I didn't know I could write Russian and I can't read Russian. I don't understand a word I'm saying. So what happens if people say, oh, I want to make perfect writing, well, that's one way to go about it. But if you write messy, because mess is currency, mess suggests to you a kind of perfection that you wouldn't think of. The mess of perfection. Perfection is messy. It's not that clean. So when you write by longhand, it cues your body and it becomes a more physical, organic kind of experience. Now, there are other ways to do it as well. I dictate into the phone. I can type, but I don't like to type as much. I would rather just hit option twice on my iPhone and just talk. I do a lot of dictation. You can write with a keyboard. The keyboard, I think, is a step later. You get it on your computer, and then you edit with the keys, the keyboard. I don't edit with my pen. So it's like the pen is like the magic wand. It invites you to relax into imperfection. And then when you read the work and like if you were to be messy with your writing, oh, I can't really read it. But then if you were to go back over it and then try to read it and record what you read, you would find that in the reading process aloud, you will already be editing the work so that you're tightening it up. And then you can, if you wanted to carry it a beat further, which I sometimes do, drop it into a transcription service once it's recorded and come back with that and then revise that onto the computer. So you have
Well,
5 or 6 steps with opportunities to create.
and I appreciate just giving me an idea here, which I appreciate. And that's the idea that I hadn't thought of dictating. I haven't done that typically in the past. So that's a really good idea.
Why not?
Let me ask you about one other thing you do, Navé. You do so many different things, but also I'm very impressed. You have it's a weekly program you run for folks. And what is that, on Zoom, or is it on?
It's on Zoom, yeah.
What is that all about?
It's called the Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week session. And we gather on Zoom every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern Time. We usually have 30 writers. These people come from all over the place. Ichno comes from South Africa. We have a goodly number from the UK. Occasionally, some of my friends from Paris will call in. A lot of people from California. And we work for an hour. We have some Asheville-based people as well. And we work for an hour, and we start with an image or a sound file, ask people to generate some response in 2 minutes, usually words or phrases. And then we read the phrases and words. Each person submits one word or phrase from their list. We create a community list, and then each person has a personal list. And then we take 10 minutes and we generate something from those 2 lists. And the idea is let your imagination storm and be the source of the inspiration, and then feed your rational mind the inspirational source from the imagination, and then let your rational mind and your imaginative mind collaborate in a dance. And then you come up with some kind of material. And at the end of the 10 minutes, then we break out in Zoom rooms and we read aloud in small rooms, then come back, and then we record an exquisite corpse. Everybody gives one phrase from the poem, and then I put that in a sound file and make it into a blog post later. And then we stay after the top of the hour for those of who want to talk about things like we've been talking about just now.
How do people find this?
You go to jamesnavé.com, and just below the fold, below my picture, you'll see a little bitty block that says, Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week Gathering, and it'll be a Zoom link, and it'll say 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And if you show up at 10 a.m. Mountain Time and you click that Zoom link on my website, jamesnavé.com, you will be in the Zoom call. It's free. We've been doing it 2 years.
Well, and you get 20, 30 people there. That's quite something.
We've got probably 60 people who loop in and out, and some of them are absolutely terrific, just really interesting people, storytellers, philosophers, bankers, probably 80% women, 20% men. I've got a lawyer named Jay who works for the Marvel. He's a Marvel Comics copyright lawyer, or Marvel movies.
Right.
He works for the Marvel movies. And then they have one woman, delightful woman from Arkansas, and just a great group of people.
And so if people want to find you, that's the best way to do. Just go to your website.
jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled Nave. It means bad movie or little turnip in French.
Okay, Navé, as always, pleasure speaking to you. Hopefully I'll get to bump into you sometime again in the near future. And we'll be speaking to you, buddy. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, stay with me as we sign off.